When someone asked Princess Margaret, "How is the Queen?" she replied, "Do you mean my sister, my mother, or my husband?" Cold, devastating, and absolutely intentional. Let that land for a moment. 3 queens in one sentence. Her sister was Queen Elizabeth II, the actual monarch sitting on the throne of the United Kingdom and ruling the Commonwealth realms. Her mother was the Queen Mother, the widow of George VI, who retained her title after his death in 1952. And her husband? Antony Armstrong-Jones was a queen in the theatrical slang of his artistic circles, a term that carried unmistakable implications about effeminacy and sexual orientation that Margaret deployed with surgical precision in front of a New York society crowd. She knew exactly what she was doing. Every word chosen, every implication calculated, every target hit. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. This was a woman who had been denied control over virtually every aspect of her existence: who she could marry, how she could live, what role she would play in the endless theater of monarchy, fighting back with the only weapon the institution allowed her to keep: her tongue. Princess Margaret could not choose whom to love. She couldn't escape her public duties or live as a private citizen beyond the reach of cameras and protocol. She couldn't denounce the system that constrained her, or walk away from the gilded cage they'd built around her before she was old enough to understand what was happening. But she could talk back. She could make observations so sharp they left marks that never quite healed. She could refuse to be merely decorative by deploying an intelligence that demanded engagement rather than mere admiration. "Disobedience is my joy," she declared on another occasion, and she meant every syllable. The establishment tried to silence her, but Margaret was simply too clever to be contained. Her life, properly understood, is not a story of scandal and moral failure. It's something far more interesting and far more tragic. The story of a brilliant woman, crushed by institutional machinery, who used wit as her primary form of resistance against a world of hypocrites who denied her love while tolerating far worse behavior from everyone around her. The aristocracy that would judge Margaret for her sharp tongue and her troubled marriage was the same aristocracy that had built its entire existence on selective enforcement of moral codes. They preached virtue they didn't practice. They demanded sacrifices they'd never make themselves. They ruined her happiness over technicalities while blessing the sins of the powerful. And Margaret? She kept score. With every perfectly timed observation, every cutting remark, every devastating one-liner that exposed their pretension while appearing merely witty. "I have as much privacy as a goldfish in a bowl," she once quipped, capturing in a single phrase the fundamental absurdity of her existence. Famous for being royal, watched constantly by a public that claimed to love her while giving her no space to breathe. The line was funny because it was true. It was devastating because it implicated everyone who laughed at it. But to understand why Margaret became this particular kind of weapon, you have to understand what was done to her first. Princess Margaret Rose arrived on August 21, 1930, at Glamis Castle in Scotland. The accident of her birth order would determine every tragedy that followed. Her sister Elizabeth was 4 years older, the heir presumptive, the future Queen of England, destined for the throne and all its attendant glory. Margaret was the spare, the ornamental sibling, the one whose primary function was to be charming, pretty, and ultimately irrelevant to the succession. She couldn't know, lying in her Scottish cradle, that this mathematical fact of her arrival would one day cost her the love of her life. The differences between the sisters emerged early and defined their entire relationship. Elizabeth was serious from childhood, already aware of the burden she would someday carry. She studied constitutional history. She learned to modulate her emotions, to present a calm face regardless of what she felt inside. She was rehearsing for the crown before she fully understood what the crown meant. Margaret was something else entirely. She was vivacious where Elizabeth was restrained, theatrical where Elizabeth was contained, possessed of a sharp intelligence that found little outlet in the limited curriculum considered appropriate for princesses. She was, by all accounts, the more naturally gifted of the two, more musical, more artistic, more alive to the pleasures of conversation and performance. She could play piano with genuine skill. She could mimic voices, tell stories, command the attention of any room she entered. None of it mattered. The institution needed one queen. Margaret was not she. And so she was raised to be decorative, to smile on cue, to wave at crowds, to fill the space beside her sister without ever claiming a space of her own. The world prepared Elizabeth for power. It prepared Margaret for nothing except marriage, which it would then proceed to make impossible. The sisters were educated at home, sheltered from common existence in a cocoon of governesses and carefully curated social interactions. Marion Crawford, Crawfie to the girls, served as their governess and later wrote a memoir that scandalized the royal family with its intimate revelations. Even the modest disclosures she made were considered a betrayal. The royal family didn't discuss itself in public, didn't reveal the humanity beneath the ceremony, didn't acknowledge that the people wearing the crowns were actually people. Margaret learned early that she existed in a fishbowl. Every childhood tantrum was noted. Every flash of temper was catalogued. She developed, as a survival mechanism, the ability to be entertaining on command, to channel her intelligence into wit rather than rebellion, to make people laugh rather than making them uncomfortable with her obvious frustration at the constraints that bound her. But the frustration was always there, beneath the charm, behind the smile, waiting for the moment when it could finally escape. Here's the thing about the British aristocracy in the mid-20th century. It functioned as a closed system of privilege, its members bound by unwritten codes that determined everything from whom one could marry to which scandals could be acknowledged, and which must be buried beneath centuries of practiced silence. The rules were not applied equally. Men of rank could maintain mistresses, they could father illegitimate children, they could engage in financial improprieties that would have destroyed any commoner's reputation, and society would look away. Women, particularly royal women, enjoyed no such latitude. They were expected to be virginal until marriage and faithful thereafter, regardless of what their husbands did, regardless of the hypocrisy that surrounded them on every side. The double standard wasn't hidden. It was simply accepted as the natural order of things. Men had needs, women had reputations. Men could be forgiven. Women could be ruined. The aristocracy had practiced this selective morality for centuries, and no one with power had any interest in changing it. Consider the Armstrong-Jones family, the family Margaret would eventually marry into after her true love was taken from her. Persistent rumors circulated through aristocratic drawing rooms that during the rationing years of wartime Britain, when ordinary families queued for meager portions of meat and butter, certain well-connected families found ways around the restrictions. The whispers alleged that the best cuts were going to their influential friends through black market channels. The Armstrong-Joneses moved in precisely the circles where such arrangements would have been possible. Where connections and wealth could circumvent the sacrifices that bound ordinary citizens. Whether the specific allegations were true or embellished, they captured something real about the class Margaret inhabited. A world where sacrifice was preached to the masses, but rarely practiced by those with the means to avoid it. Rationing affected everyone in theory. In practice, it affected the powerful far less than anyone else. The working-class mother queuing for her family's meager meat allowance existed in an entirely different universe from the society hostess whose connections ensured she never went without. This was the glittering prison Margaret inherited. The aristocracy demanded that she be beautiful, entertaining, and available for public consumption. Yet it also demanded that she remain fundamentally powerless, a decorative figure whose desires were subordinate to institutional convenience. The Church of England, of which her sister would become supreme governor, preached the indissolubility of Christian marriage. Meanwhile, it presided over a society that tolerated cruelty, abandonment, and betrayal within marriages as a matter of course, so long as no one sought divorce. Divorce was the unpardonable sin, not because it actually transgressed any moral code the aristocracy cared about, but because it made private failures public. It broke the code of silence that kept the whole rotten structure standing. Adultery? Fine, so long as you were discreet. Domestic cruelty? Unfortunate, but manageable. Financial exploitation? A private matter between gentlemen. But divorce was visible. Divorce was documented. Divorce left a paper trail that couldn't be buried in whispered conversations at country house parties. And Margaret, watching this theater of hypocrisy from her gilded cage, developed what would become her primary weapon. From childhood, she displayed a gift for the perfectly timed observation, the cutting remark that exposed pretension while appearing merely witty, the kind of intelligence that made powerful people uncomfortable because it refused to pretend along with them. She was 17 years old when she met the man who would make her understand exactly how ruthless the institution could be. The South Africa tour of 1947 was meant to be a triumph of post-war monarchy, a demonstration that the British royal family could still project glamour across an empire straining at its seams. King George VI brought his family to Cape Town to celebrate the union of South Africa's loyalty to the crown. Princess Elizabeth would deliver her famous 21st birthday broadcast from there, pledging her life to Commonwealth service. Princess Margaret, 17 years old, was present primarily as a supporting character. What happened instead altered the trajectory of her entire life. The voyage itself lasted weeks. The royal family traveled aboard HMS Vanguard, the largest battleship ever built for the Royal Navy, converted for the occasion into a floating palace. The accommodations were luxurious by post-war standards. Private cabins, formal dining, the full apparatus of royal protocol maintained even at sea. But the isolation was profound. Weeks on the water with the same small group of people, the same conversations repeated, the same faces at every meal. Group Captain Peter Townsend was 32 years old that year, a Battle of Britain hero serving as equerry to the king. He had shot down at least 11 German aircraft during the war, earning the Distinguished Flying Cross and Bar for his valor. Handsome in that particular English way, tall, lean, with a face that suggested both strength and sensitivity. The kind of man who had seen death up close and carried it quietly, without complaint. He was also unhappily married, trapped in a union that had soured during the war years when his wife had conducted affairs during his absence. The pattern was common enough. Men went to fight, women left behind sought comfort where they could find it. Marriages that had seemed solid before the bombs started falling crumbled under the weight of separation and infidelity. By 1947, Townsend's marriage existed in name only. But divorce remained unthinkable for a man serving in the intimate circle of the royal household. Margaret first truly noticed him during the long sea voyage to South Africa. And he noticed her noticing. She was 17, technically still a child by the standards of the era, but possessed of a precocious intelligence and a beauty that was beginning to eclipse even her sisters. Elizabeth was pretty in a conventional way, pleasant features, appropriate bearing, the kind of looks that photographed well without demanding too much attention. Margaret was something else. She had their mother's eyes, those remarkable blue eyes that seemed to see everything and judge it all. She had a figure that would become famous, and she had that spark, that quality of aliveness that made people want to watch her. Townsend was 15 years her senior, old enough to know better, experienced enough to recognize danger, yet unable to prevent what was happening between them. The shipboard environment fostered intimacy in ways that would have been impossible in London. The long days at sea, the formal dinners, the shared spaces of royal life conspired to throw them together repeatedly. Margaret sought him out for conversation. He found himself looking forward to their talks. What began as adolescent infatuation on her part, a teenager's crush on a handsome war hero, gradually transformed into something more complicated, more adult, more dangerous. The relationship developed slowly over the years that followed, taking root in the hothouse atmosphere of royal duty. Townsend saw Margaret constantly in his role as equerry. She saw in him a man who treated her not as a princess to be deferred to, but as a person worthy of genuine conversation. He was cultured, sensitive, capable of discussing poetry and music on her level. He took her seriously in ways that other men in her orbit did not. He was also wounded, first by the war, then by his failing marriage. And Margaret, for all her sharp wit, possessed a deep capacity for empathy toward suffering. She fell in love with him gradually, then completely. In the manner of someone who has found, at last, a person who sees her rather than her title. Not Princess Margaret, ornamental sister of the heir to the throne, just Margaret, a woman with thoughts and feelings and desires that mattered. By the early 1950s, discretion was becoming impossible. The relationship had deepened over 6 years, from that first voyage to countless subsequent encounters at royal functions and private moments stolen between official duties. Townsend's divorce became final in 1952, naming his wife as the guilty party. He was now technically free to remarry, free in the eyes of civil law, at least. But royal law operated by different rules entirely. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, all descendants of George II required the sovereign's permission before marrying, at least until they reached age 25. Margaret was 21 when Townsend's divorce was finalized. She could not marry anyone at all, without her sister Elizabeth's explicit consent. And Elizabeth, as head of the Church of England, could not consent to her marrying a divorced man. The trap had closed, and Margaret, for all her wit, could not talk her way out of this one. June 2nd, 1953, stands as one of the most watched events in human history. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, broadcast to an audience of 20 million in the United Kingdom alone. Westminster Abbey transformed into a stage set of medieval grandeur. The young queen processed through streets lined with crowds who had waited overnight in the rain. The ceremony itself lasted 3 hours, an elaborate ritual unchanged in its essentials for 1,000 years. Every moment was choreographed, every gesture rehearsed. Every participant knew their role and performed it with the precision that monarchy demands. Princess Margaret, 22 years old and luminously beautiful, stood among the royal party in full ceremonial dress. She wore a gown of white satin, her coronet sparkling beneath the abbey's lights. She played her part perfectly. The devoted sister, the supporting presence, the ornamental princess fulfilling her ornamental function. Townsend was present as well, his equerry duties requiring his attendance. They had been careful, so careful, throughout the years of their clandestine love. In public, they maintained appropriate distance. In private, they had committed themselves to a future together that seemed increasingly impossible to achieve. But the coronation day undid them in an instant. The moment occurred in the Abbey Annex after the ceremony. The participants were milling about, the formal ritual complete. The human beings beneath the crowns and robes allowed briefly to breathe. Margaret, standing near Townsend, reached out and brushed a piece of lint from the lapel of his RAF uniform. That's all. Just a gesture. The kind of small attention that lovers pay each other without thinking. So automatic, so natural, that Margaret likely didn't even realize what she was doing until it was done. A wife might brush lint from her husband's jacket without anyone noticing. A lover might do the same without conscious thought. But Princess Margaret was not supposed to have a lover, and certainly not this one. A journalist from the People newspaper observed the gesture and understood instantly its significance. Here was Princess Margaret, third in line to the throne, touching a divorced man with the casual intimacy of a wife. At her sister's coronation, in full view of anyone who cared to look. The story broke 2 weeks later. What followed was a firestorm across the British press, and then the international media. "The Princess and the Group Captain," screamed the headlines. "Royal romance revealed." The romance that had been whispered about in aristocratic circles was now public property. Every detail was examined, every previous encounter reinterpreted in light of this new information. The establishment response was swift and merciless. Townsend was effectively exiled, reassigned as heir attaché to the British Embassy in Brussels, a transparent attempt to separate the lovers by putting a continent between them. The posting was dressed up as a promotion, a recognition of his distinguished service. Everyone understood what it actually was: banishment. Margaret was forced to continue her public duties as though nothing had happened, smiling and waving, while her heart was being methodically broken. Opening hospitals, attending charity galas, pretending that the man she loved hadn't just been sent away because loving her was a crime against the institution. The Church of England's opposition was theological in theory, political in practice. Archbishop Geoffrey Fisher declared that he could not countenance the marriage of a princess to a divorced man, regardless of the circumstances. The fact that Townsend had been the innocent party, that his wife had committed the adultery, was irrelevant to a church that considered all divorce equally sinful. Fisher was adamant. If Margaret married Townsend, she would be condoning divorce by her example. That Fisher's church presided over countless aristocratic marriages that were shams of convenience? That he turned a blind eye to adultery among the titled classes so long as it never reached the divorce courts? Apparently beside the point. The Archbishop's position was supported by significant portions of the British establishment. The Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, initially hoped the matter could be resolved quietly. When it became clear that Margaret intended to wait until she was 25 and could theoretically marry without her sister's permission, the government began preparing for a constitutional crisis. The irony was suffocating. The church that had been created by Henry VIII specifically so he could divorce his wife was now refusing to permit a princess to marry a divorced man. The institution that had rewritten religious doctrine to accommodate royal desire in the 16th century had apparently developed scruples in the 20th. The 2-year period between the coronation scandal and Margaret's 25th birthday became an exercise in sustained cruelty. Margaret and Townsend were forbidden to see each other. He remained in Brussels, she in London. Their contact limited to letters that were certainly monitored by palace officials. The establishment hoped that time and distance would cool their ardor. Instead, the separation only intensified their commitment. 2 years is a long time to love someone you cannot see, a long time to maintain hope when every authority figure in your life is working to destroy it. A long time to believe that patience will be rewarded when patience keeps demanding more of itself. Margaret refused to consider other suitors. Young aristocrats were paraded before her, eligible, appropriate, boring. She dismissed them all. She attended the events her position required, smiled for the cameras, fulfilled her public duties with the competence she had been trained to display, but her heart was in Brussels. Townsend wrote faithfully, maintaining the connection across the miles and months. His letters were careful. He knew they were being read, but they conveyed enough. He had not forgotten. He had not moved on. He was waiting, as she was waiting, for the day when waiting would finally end. When Margaret finally turned 25 on August 21st, 1955, they were as determined to marry as they had ever been. But turning 25 did not grant freedom. Under the Royal Marriages Act, Margaret could now marry without the Queen's consent, but only after giving 12 months' notice to the Privy Council, which could recommend that Parliament block the match. Prime Minister Anthony Eden made clear that the government would not support the marriage. The cabinet was prepared to introduce legislation specifically designed to prevent Margaret from marrying Townsend if she insisted on proceeding. The financial threats were severe. Or so Margaret was told. She would lose her £6,000 annual allowance from the civil list, plus the £15,000 marriage settlement she would otherwise have received. She would be stripped of her place in the line of succession. She might, they implied, effectively cease to be a princess at all. But here's what Margaret didn't know, what was kept from her by a government determined to crush her hopes. The financial threat was largely a bluff. Declassified documents, released decades later, reveal that Prime Minister Eden had secretly prepared contingency plans that would have allowed Margaret to marry Townsend while retaining her title, her royal status, and her income. The harsh terms presented to her as inevitable were, in fact, negotiable. The government simply chose not to negotiate. And the irony? The suffocating, infuriating irony? Anthony Eden himself had divorced his first wife and remarried. The very act that Margaret was told would be impossible for her. Eden had married his second wife, Clarissa Churchill, Winston's niece, in a church ceremony in 1952. He saw no contradiction between his own behavior and his demands on Margaret. Because the rules had never been about principle, they were about power, about maintaining control over royal women who might otherwise embarrass the establishment by making their own choices. This is what one commenter on a video about Margaret's life meant when they wrote, "They are far more dishonest and hypocritical." The divorced prime minister lecturing the princess about the sanctity of marriage, the establishment that accepted rumored black market dealings and aristocratic adultery while destroying a woman's life over the technicality of her beloved's marital history. The church that blessed second marriages for the powerful while denying them to the princess. Margaret was being asked to destroy her happiness for the sake of a lie that everyone in power knew was a lie. The precedent they used against her had been established just 19 years earlier, when Edward VIII abdicated to marry the American divorcee, Wallis Simpson. That crisis had nearly destroyed the monarchy. The establishment was determined never to allow a repeat. But the situations weren't equivalent. Edward was the king himself, attempting to make a divorced woman queen. Margaret was third in line. Townsend would never have been anything but her husband. The precedent was invoked, not because it was legally binding, but because it was politically convenient. Another example of rules applied selectively to achieve desired outcomes. The decision came in the final days of October 1955. Townsend had returned to England. The 2-year exile lifted. He and Margaret spent several days together at Clarence House, trying to chart a path through impossible terrain. The press camped outside, photographing every arrival and departure, broadcasting speculation about whether the princess would defy the establishment or submit. Inside, two people who had loved each other for nearly a decade confronted the reality that love might not be enough. Margaret understood what life outside the royal fold would actually mean. She had never lived as a private citizen, never earned her own income, never existed without the buffer of privilege. If she married Townsend and lost her allowance, she would be dependent entirely on his modest military pension. But it wasn't really about the money. It was about meaning. What would she be, stripped of her royal identity? A divorced man's wife, hosting dinner parties in some suburban house, attending garden parties as a guest rather than a principal? The institution had made her into Princess Margaret, and Princess Margaret was the only self she knew. More than that, Margaret understood, perhaps for the first time, that leaving the royal family would not free her from scrutiny. It would intensify it. Every stumble in her new life would be chronicled. Every difficulty would be held up as proof that she had made the wrong choice. The tabloids that currently treated her as a princess would treat her as a cautionary tale. The woman who gave up everything for love and discovered that love wasn't enough. On October 31st, 1955, Margaret released a statement crafted with Archbishop Fisher's help, the very man who had done so much to destroy her happiness. I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others. The statement was a masterpiece of institutional propaganda. It presented Margaret as willingly choosing duty over love, as embracing the Church's teaching rather than being crushed by it. Nothing acknowledged the enforced separation, the lies about what was possible, the hypocrisy of Eden's government. The establishment had won, and they wanted their victory to look like Margaret's choice. What happened to Peter Townsend after? The question matters because it reveals something about what Margaret lost. He left England. There was nothing left for him there. He traveled extensively, through Europe, Africa, Asia. He drove around the world in a Land Rover, covering 60,000 miles over 2.5 years, as if trying to put enough distance between himself and the memory of what might have been. Think about that. 60,000 miles. 2.5 years of constant motion, running from a heartbreak that no amount of geography could cure. Eventually, in 1959, he married a young Belgian woman named Marie-Luce Gemagne. She was 20 years old. They had 3 children together and remained married until his death in 1995. By all accounts, it was a happy marriage. He never spoke publicly against Margaret, never sold his story to the tabloids, never capitalized on the relationship that had nearly destroyed both their lives. When he wrote his memoirs, he treated her with dignity and discretion. A gentleman to the end, even when being a gentleman had cost him everything. Margaret watched from afar. There's no public record of sustained contact between them after 1955, though they moved in overlapping worlds and would have heard news of each other through mutual connections. Did she feel regret? Relief? Some complicated mixture of both? She never said. But she did marry, eventually, and the marriage the establishment permitted tells you everything about their priorities. The years between Townsend and Tony were wilderness years for Margaret. She was 25 years old in 1955, publicly humiliated, her love life a matter of international speculation. She had been told she could not marry the man she loved. She had been told implicitly that she should find someone else. But who? The pool of eligible men was vanishingly small. He had to be acceptable to the establishment, which meant not divorced, not Catholic, not scandalous in any way that couldn't be quietly managed. He had to be willing to accept a supporting role in a marriage that would always be defined by her title rather than his personality. He had to be interesting enough to engage Margaret's intelligence, but compliant enough not to threaten the palace hierarchy. Margaret went through the motions. She attended parties. She was seen with various young men. The press speculated endlessly about each potential suitor. None of them took. The truth was that Margaret had been spoiled for ordinary romance. She had experienced genuine love with Townsend, the kind of connection that makes all subsequent relationships feel thin by comparison. The aristocratic young men who pursued her seemed interchangeable. The same backgrounds, the same educations, the same carefully cultivated blandness that the upper classes mistook for good breeding. They bored her senseless. And then came Antony Armstrong-Jones. Tony was nothing like the usual candidates. He was a photographer, a profession that barely registered as respectable in aristocratic circles. He came from a complicated family background. His parents had divorced when he was young, his father remarrying twice, his mother remarrying an Irish peer. He had shuttled between these fractured households, belonging fully to neither, developing the chameleon quality that would define his adult life. He was not aristocratic. This mattered more than anyone acknowledged at the time. Tony had made his name photographing the theatrical world. Actors, dancers, directors, the creative classes that respectable society viewed with mingled fascination and condemnation. He moved in bohemian circles. He attended parties where the guest lists would have scandalized Buckingham Palace. He knew people who used drugs, who conducted affairs openly, who treated conventional morality as a quaint relic of their parents' generation. He was also magnetic, dark-haired, slight, possessed of an intensity that could feel like interest or menace, depending on the circumstances. He photographed Margaret for her 29th birthday in 1959, and the chemistry between them was immediate. Here was someone who didn't defer to her automatically, someone who pushed back when she was imperious, who made her laugh with observations that veered toward cruelty, who treated her as a conquest rather than a commodity. After years of boring suitors, the challenge was intoxicating. The courtship was conducted in secret. Tony understood the value of discretion and the value of eventually being discovered. They met at parties, at his studio, at the houses of mutual friends who could be trusted not to talk. Margaret had learned, painfully, what public exposure could cost. She was determined not to make the same mistake twice. The establishment had blocked Margaret from marrying a divorced war hero because divorce was apparently unforgivable. But they permitted her to marry a commoner photographer whose family background included divorce on both sides, whose social circle was theatrical and bohemian. Exactly the kind of world where terms like queen carried certain unmistakable meanings. The contradiction was so blatant that only deliberate blindness could miss it. Why was Armstrong-Jones acceptable when Townsend wasn't? The answer lies not in morality but in threat assessment. Townsend threatened the establishment because Margaret genuinely loved him, because she would have been happy with him, because their marriage would have represented her choosing her own path, defying institutional control, demonstrating that a royal woman could make her own decisions about her own life. Armstrong-Jones posed no such threat. Margaret didn't love him the way she had loved Townsend. She was fond of him, attracted to him, entertained by him. He was different from the usual aristocratic suitors who bored her senseless with their predictable opinions and careful deference. He was artistic, creative, willing to argue with her. He treated her as an equal in conversation, which was refreshing. But it wasn't love. Not the consuming, decade-long devotion she had felt for Townsend. The establishment recognized the difference. They approved. The engagement was announced on February 26, 1960. The wedding took place on May 6 at Westminster Abbey, the first royal wedding broadcast on television, watched by an estimated 300 million people worldwide. The contrast with the Townsend situation was impossible to ignore. Margaret, whose proposed marriage to a decorated war hero had been blocked on grounds of religious principle, was now marrying a commoner photographer in Westminster Abbey with the full blessing of the Church of England. The Archbishop, who had insisted that divorce was an insurmountable obstacle, was apparently comfortable blessing this union. Margaret wore a dress designed by Norman Hartnell, the same designer who had created her sister's coronation gown. The dress was simple by royal standards. No elaborate train, no excessive embellishment, as if Margaret was trying to signal that this wedding was different from what it appeared to be. Something smaller, something more honest. Armstrong-Jones was created Earl of Snowdon and Viscount Linley on the morning of the wedding, transforming him from a commoner into a peer in time for the ceremony. The transformation was symbolic of everything wrong with the match. The establishment had to remake Armstrong-Jones into something acceptable. He wasn't suitable as he actually was, a photographer, a commoner, a man of artistic inclinations and complicated family history. They had to dress him up in a title, wrap him in aristocratic trappings, pretend he was something other than what he was. Margaret had wanted to marry Townsend exactly as he was. The establishment had refused. Now they were demanding she accept Armstrong-Jones as someone he pretended to be. The marriage was doomed from the start. The early 1960s should have been Margaret's triumph. She was beautiful, glamorous, married to a handsome photographer who brought her into contact with the most exciting artistic and social circles in London. The swinging 60s were beginning. The old social order was crumbling. Music, fashion, art, photography. Everything was changing. Everything was possible. Margaret had access to all of it, and for a while she seemed to embrace it. The Snowdons, as they were now styled, became fixtures of the London scene. They threw parties that brought together aristocrats and artists, actors and musicians, old money and new talent. The guest lists read like a catalog of mid-century cultural influence. Peter Sellers, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the designers and models and photographers who were redefining British style. The contrast between these gatherings and traditional royal entertaining could not have been starker. At Buckingham Palace, dinners followed prescribed formulas. Guests were seated according to precedents. Conversation was polite, careful, drained of anything that might be considered controversial. At the Snowdons' parties, people argued about art. They gossiped about affairs. They drank too much and said things they'd regret in the morning. Margaret loved it. For the first time in her life, she was the center of a world she had chosen rather than inherited. These people weren't deferring to her because she was a princess. They were including her because she was entertaining, because she could hold her own in conversations about culture and politics, because she added something to the gathering beyond her title. Tony photographed everyone who mattered. Margaret provided the royal glamour that made their gatherings irresistible to social climbers and genuine talents alike. It was a partnership of sorts, not emotional perhaps, but functional. They had children. David, Viscount Linley, was born on November 3, 1961. Lady Sarah Armstrong-Jones arrived on May 1, 1964. Margaret, by all accounts, loved her children deeply. Whatever else failed in her life, motherhood didn't. But the marriage itself was deteriorating almost from the moment it began. The fundamental problem was that Tony had married a princess, but Margaret had married a photographer. She expected to remain the center of attention, the star around whom his life would orbit. He expected to continue his career, his social life, his independence. Neither was willing to subordinate themselves to the other. The social circles that had brought them together became battlegrounds. Margaret wanted to be the hostess, the center of attention, the reason people came to their parties. Tony wanted to be recognized for his own achievements, not as a royal consort. They competed for prominence in their own home, and competition soured into resentment. He was cruel in the specific, calculated way of a man who knows exactly where the vulnerabilities lie. Tony left notes. This became his particular method of communication when the marriage soured. Little pieces of paper tucked into books, left on pillows, positioned where Margaret would find them. The notes cataloged her failings, her drinking, her weight, her age, her neediness. He knew she would find them. He knew they would wound her. That was the point. Margaret had been raised to believe she was special, not just special in the ordinary sense, special in the constitutional sense, important to the nation, worthy of deference and attention. Tony systematically dismantled that belief. He mocked her in front of friends. He contradicted her in conversation. He made clear in 100 small ways that he found her tiresome. And yet he stayed. They both stayed. Because divorce remained scandalous, even as everything else changed. The Church of England was still officially opposed. The establishment that had destroyed Margaret's chance at happiness with Townsend would not look kindly on her confirming their original judgment by failing at the marriage they had permitted. She was trapped again, this time by a different set of rules, but trapped nonetheless. So they developed a modus vivendi. Tony had his life, Margaret had hers. They appeared together when duty required, maintained separate bedrooms, pursued separate interests. He had affairs, that much was widely known in their social circle, though the press maintained discretion. She sought comfort where she could find it. The public saw glamour. Inside was wreckage. By the late 1960s, Margaret had discovered Mustique. The island had been given to her as a wedding present by her friend Colin Tennant, who had purchased the entire Caribbean island in 1958 for £45,000. It was undeveloped, remote, beautiful, and most importantly, it was private. The press couldn't camp outside the gates when there were no gates, no roads, no infrastructure at all. Margaret built a house there. Les Jolies Eaux, she called it, the beautiful waters. It was modest by royal standards, a whitewashed villa with views of the Caribbean, designed by Oliver Messel, Tony's uncle. No palace pretensions, no requirement to maintain appearances, just a place where she could swim, entertain friends, and exist without the constant surveillance that defined her life in England. Mustique became her refuge. Her rebellion by other means. The island's social scene was louche in ways that would have scandalized the establishment that had judged Margaret so harshly. Drugs, affairs, unconventional relationships, Mustique tolerated all of it. Attracted people who wanted to escape the restrictions of conventional society. The island had no paparazzi, no journalists lurking behind hedges, no one to report what happened there to the readers of British tabloids. Margaret fit right in. Which tells you something about how constrained she felt everywhere else. Was she happy there? Happier, probably, than she was at Kensington Palace. She could drink without being photographed. She could swim without worrying about the headlines. She could be Margaret, rather than HRH, the Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, and all the expectations that title carried. But Mustique was also an escape from a life that had failed her, a retreat rather than a victory. The establishment had broken her, and this island was where she went to hide the damage. The marriage finally ended because of a gardener. That's oversimplifying, of course. The marriage ended because it had never really worked, because Tony and Margaret had made each other miserable for nearly 2 decades, because staying together had become more painful than the scandal of separation. But the immediate cause was Roddy Llewellyn. Margaret met him in September 1973 at a house party in Scotland. He was 25 years old, 17 years her junior. She was 43, trapped in a dead marriage, drinking too much, finding comfort where she could. Roddy was handsome in a soft, unthreatening way. He was a gardener, an aspiring landscape designer really, though he hadn't yet established himself. He was also gentle, adoring, willing to treat Margaret as the center of his universe in ways that Tony had refused to do for years. The affair became serious quickly. Margaret invited Roddy to Mustique. They were photographed together on the beach in February 1976, the images making the front page of the News of the World. A 45-year-old princess in a bathing suit with a man nearly half her age. The scandal was exactly what the establishment had always feared from Margaret. exactly what they had tried to prevent by blocking her marriage to Townsend. Tony used the photographs as justification for what he had wanted for years. The separation was announced on March 19, 1976. The divorce was finalized on May 24, 1978. Margaret was the first senior royal to divorce since Henry VIII. The institution that had destroyed her chance at happiness in 1955, because divorce was unacceptable, now had to accept that she had joined the divorced ranks anyway. The principle they had invoked against Townsend lay in ruins, but Margaret took no satisfaction from this. How could she? The victory, if you could call it that, came 23 years too late. She had suffered through a miserable marriage to satisfy institutional requirements, and now the institution was allowing her to escape it. The rules had changed, but only after she had paid the full price of the old rules. Margaret should have married Peter Townsend, obviously. The evidence had been there all along. She loved Townsend in a way she never loved Armstrong-Jones. Townsend was honorable, devoted, willing to sacrifice everything for her. Their marriage might have been happy, would almost certainly have been happier than the marriage she was pushed into instead. The institution prevented it, not because of genuine principle, but because a woman making her own choice was more threatening than any divorce. And then the institution changed the rules after it was too late for Margaret. The Roddy Llewellyn relationship continued after the divorce, though it gradually faded. He eventually married someone else in 1981. Margaret found other companions, other distractions, other ways to fill the emptiness. She never remarried. This fact is significant. Margaret had been told in 1955 that remarriage after divorce was impossible for a princess. She had accepted that verdict, given up the love of her life, spent 18 years in a marriage that brought her no happiness, and then, when she was finally free, when divorce was no longer scandalous, when she could theoretically have married anyone she wanted, she chose to remain alone. Perhaps there was no one left who measured up to Townsend. Perhaps she was too damaged by then, too wary of intimacy, too accustomed to disappointment. Perhaps she simply preferred her independence to the compromises that marriage required. Or perhaps she understood something fundamental about the institution that had shaped her life. It would always find new ways to constrain her. Better to stop trying. Better to carve out what freedom she could within the spaces they allowed. Her drinking increased in the 1980s. So did her smoking. Famous grouse whiskey. Cigarettes consumed in quantities that alarmed her friends. She had always smoked. It was one of her signatures, the cigarette in the long holder, the sophisticated gesture that signaled her refusal to conform to expectations about how princesses should behave. Now the cigarettes were taking their toll. Her health declined. Her voice grew rougher. The glamour that had defined her youth faded into something harder, more brittle. The public judgment intensified. The same tabloids that had romanticized her affair with Townsend now painted her as a cautionary tale, the princess who had wasted her privilege on pleasure, who had drunk and smoked and scandalized her way through the years. They forgot, or chose to ignore, everything that had been done to her. The love denied, the marriage imposed, the decades of unhappiness she had endured because the establishment demanded it. They saw only the results, not the causes. The 1990s brought physical collapse. In 1998, Margaret suffered a stroke while staying at Mustique, the same island that had been her refuge for 30 years. More strokes followed in 1999 and 2001. She lost mobility, became confined to a wheelchair, required constant care. There was a scalding accident in her bathroom in 1999. She had run herself a bath, misjudged the temperature, burned her feet badly enough to require hospitalization. The incident spoke to her diminished capacity, her vulnerability, the collapse of the independence she had fought so hard to maintain. The woman who had declared, Disobedience is my joy, now required help with the most basic functions of daily life. The wit that had been her weapon was blunted by illness. The beauty that had made her famous faded into frailty. She died on February 9, 2002, at King Edward VII's Hospital in London. She was 71 years old. The cause was cardiac problems following her strokes, though you could argue that the real causes lay much further back, in the cigarettes she had smoked for 50 years, in the whiskey that had helped her endure the unendurable. Her death was overshadowed within weeks. The Queen Mother, her mother, one of the 3 queens in that devastating dinner party quip, died on March 30th of the same year, at the age of 101. The funeral coverage, the national mourning, focused on the mother rather than the daughter. Even in death, Margaret was the supporting character, the spare. But the obituaries acknowledged something that the establishment had spent decades trying to suppress. Margaret had been more interesting than her sister. Not more important, not more powerful, not more historically significant. More interesting. Elizabeth was dutiful and reserved, a constitutional monarch who had perfected the art of saying nothing while appearing to say something. Margaret was sharp and unpredictable, a woman who had opinions and expressed them, who made people uncomfortable, who refused to pretend along with the rest of them. Elizabeth followed the rules. Margaret questioned them, violated them, exposed their hypocrisy with every sharp remark. Elizabeth became the symbol of stable monarchy. Margaret became the symbol of everything the monarchy tried to hide. Desire, frustration, rebellion, the human cost of being trapped inside a system you didn't choose. The institution would prefer you remember Elizabeth, but you remember Margaret. Margaret's relationship with her sister remains one of the most poignant elements of her story. They were close as children. Had to be, really, given their isolation from ordinary children. They shared governesses, tutors, the peculiar experience of growing up royal. Elizabeth was the serious one. Margaret was the entertainer. They complemented each other, but the relationship shifted irrevocably in 1952, when their father died and Elizabeth became queen. Suddenly, the 4-year age gap became something else entirely, a constitutional chasm. Elizabeth was the sovereign, the head of state, the supreme governor of the Church of England. Margaret was her subject. When Margaret wanted to marry Townsend, she had to ask her sister's permission. Elizabeth couldn't grant it, not as head of the church that forbade remarriage after divorce. Whether she wanted to grant it is a question biographers have debated for decades. Elizabeth was devoted to duty above all else. It's possible she genuinely believed that institutional requirements outweighed personal happiness, even her sister's personal happiness. Or, perhaps, she was simply trapped by the same system that trapped Margaret. Unable to say yes even if she wanted to, required to enforce rules she might privately have questioned. The relationship survived, but it was never uncomplicated after 1955. Margaret had sacrificed her happiness because Elizabeth couldn't, or wouldn't, grant permission for the marriage she wanted. That knowledge sat between them for the remaining 50 years of Margaret's life. At Margaret's funeral, Elizabeth was visibly moved. Whatever tensions had existed between them, whatever resentments Margaret may have harbored, the bond between the sisters was real. They had shared a childhood, a family, a century of royal history. They had understood each other in ways that outsiders never could. Elizabeth outlived Margaret by more than 2 decades. She never spoke publicly about her sister's death, never addressed the choices that had shaped Margaret's life. She maintained the silence that the monarchy demands. But you have to wonder what she thought, in private moments, about the sister who had been denied love in 1955. Whether she ever questioned the principles that had required such sacrifice. Whether she ever wished things had been different. We'll never know. The institution keeps its secrets. There's a particular kind of courage in refusing to be pleasant when pleasantness is demanded from you. Margaret understood that her role was to be decorative, charming, non-threatening. The spare princess, smiling in photographs, making small talk at endless official functions, never outshining her sister, never claiming too much attention, never making anyone uncomfortable. She violated every expectation. Her smoking was conspicuous in an era when royal women weren't supposed to be seen with cigarettes. Her drinking was noted and discussed. Her opinions were offered freely, without the diplomatic hedging that characterized royal speech. She said what she thought, even when, especially when, it made people squirm. The establishment wanted a silent ornament. They got a woman who talked back. And here's the thing. The talking back was the point. Every sharp observation was a small act of resistance. Every devastating one-liner was a reminder that she was a person, not a prop. Every time she made someone uncomfortable, she was asserting her existence against a system that wanted her to fade politely into the background. Watch the pattern in her wit. Her sharpest remarks were aimed upward, not downward, at the hypocrites who had constrained her life while excusing their own failures, at the establishment figures who preached virtue they didn't practice, at the whole elaborate machinery of aristocratic society that demanded women be ornamental while tolerating every vice from the men who ruled it. When Margaret was sharp, she was almost always fighting back. My sister, my mother, or my husband? The question pretended to seek clarification. It actually sought destruction. 3 queens in 3 contexts, delivered with innocent precision, exposing every tension in her life, her subordination to her sister, her mother's lingering presence, her husband's artistic circles and what they implied. Disobedience is my joy. The declaration of a woman who couldn't actually disobey in the ways that mattered. She couldn't have married Townsend. She couldn't have walked away from royal life. She couldn't have been simply Margaret, whoever that might have been without the crushing weight of title and expectation. But she could announce her intentions. She could make clear that compliance was not consent. I have as much privacy as a goldfish in a bowl. The complaint of someone who understood exactly what was being done to her. She was public property, watched constantly, judged for every cigarette, every drink, every sharp remark. The same people who consumed her life like entertainment felt entitled to lecture her about how she should live it. The goldfish can't escape the bowl, but it can refuse to swim in the approved direction. The question that follows Margaret through history is whether she was tragic or simply difficult. The distinction matters less than people pretend. Of course, she was difficult. Wouldn't you be? Imagine having your great love taken from you at 25 by hypocrites who themselves violated every principle they used against you. Imagine being told the rules are the rules, only to watch those same rules bent and broken for everyone with more power than you have. Imagine being raised as a princess, made into a symbol, and then punished for the very qualities, beauty, wit, charisma, that the institution had cultivated in you. Margaret became difficult because the alternative was disappearing, becoming merely decorative, letting the machine grind her into pleasant insignificance. She refused. And yes, the refusal sometimes came out as cruelty. Sometimes the sharp remarks wounded people who didn't deserve it. Sometimes the rebellion became self-destruction. The cigarettes, the drinking, the relationships that went nowhere. She wasn't a saint, she never claimed to be. But the institution that judged her harshest was the institution that had created the conditions for her failures. They denied her love, pushed her into an unsuitable marriage, demanded constant public performance while offering no private fulfillment, and then acted shocked, when she didn't handle it gracefully. The biographer Craig Brown, in his examination of Margaret's life, captured the essential paradox. She was simultaneously too royal to be ordinary and too human to be merely royal. She couldn't fit into either category, so she carved out a third space, the witty, difficult, impossible princess who refused to be what anyone expected. The rules were applied selectively. They always had been. Margaret's crime wasn't being difficult. Her crime was being a difficult woman. Margaret's legacy isn't her scandals. It isn't the cigarettes, the drinking, the marriages that ended badly. It isn't the tabloid coverage that reduced her to gossip fodder for decades. Her legacy is the wit. Every sharp quote was a small rebellion. Every devastating observation was a refusal to be crushed. Every time she made the powerful uncomfortable, she was winning a small victory against a system designed to silence her. My sister, my mother, or my husband. 3 queens, 3 contexts. One devastating demonstration of precisely how trapped she was and how clearly she understood her situation. Disobedience is my joy. The battle cry of a woman who couldn't actually rebel, fighting back the only way she could. I have as much privacy as a goldfish in a bowl. The observation of someone who knew she was being watched, judged, consumed, and refused to pretend otherwise. The aristocracy wanted her to disappear politely, to accept her constraints with grace, to smile and wave, and never, ever make anyone uncomfortable with the truth of her situation. She was simply too clever to be contained. They may have denied her Peter Townsend. They may have forced her into a marriage that brought her no happiness. They may have judged her by standards they never applied to themselves. But she got the last word. Every sharp comment, every devastating observation, every witticism that exposed the hypocrisy of the system that constrained her. Margaret fought back with the only weapon available to her. Her tongue was sharper than their rules, and she won. Subscribe for more stories like this.